The last time you tried to explain yourself to that person, you knew while you were still talking that it wouldn't land. That was the last time. Maybe someone asked you recently why you made a particular decision, why you didn't attend something, why you had been distant, why you reacted the way you did, and you felt the old pull, that familiar preparation to justify, to contextualize, to lay out your entire interior logic for someone who was asking. And then you didn't. Not because you had closed, but because you had learned something that takes most people years to name. That explaining yourself to someone who doesn't intend to understand you is not honesty. It is practice. Practice at being misread with more detail. You are not cold. You are not withholding. And you are not, as they have sometimes suggested, difficult to love. There's a name for what you have actually been doing, and it did not begin with a flaw. Here is what they have called it. You never tell me anything. I feel like I don't know you. You've changed. You used to be more open. You're impossible to reach. And there is something particular about the structure of the accusation. It implies that the explaining was for them, that your interior life was something they were owed, and that your silence is a deliberate removal of what belonged to them. But that was never what the explaining was for. The explaining was always for you. It was the act of hoping that if you described the shape of what you felt precisely enough, carefully enough, someone would finally recognize it. And when that never happened, when the explaining only ever produced more questions, more dismissals, or more ammunition, the explaining became the wound rather than the remedy. They called it cold. What it actually was the last time you handed someone the language to hurt you with. In psychology, there is a name for the pattern we have been describing. It is called protective silence. And it is not emotional immaturity. It is not emotional unavailability. It is a learned response, highly sophisticated, in which the nervous system has concluded that the cost of being known by a particular person exceeds whatever that knowing might return. There is also a neurological reality here worth understanding. There is a region in the brain, Broca's area, responsible for producing language. Researchers have found that during periods of emotional flooding, this region goes quiet. Not because you're choosing not to speak, because your brain is managing something more urgent than speech. It is using everything it has to keep you intact. So when someone stands in front of you saying, "Just explain it to me, just tell me what's wrong," and you stand there with nothing arriving, that is not stubbornness. That is your nervous system doing triage. When your brain is flooded, language doesn't disappear. It goes somewhere safer. That is not avoidance. That is your nervous system doing exactly what it learned it needed to do. Nobody is born knowing not to explain themselves. Children are extraordinarily transparent. They express pain loudly and without apology, and without any consideration of whether the timing is convenient, until something teaches them otherwise. Maybe you grew up in a home where explaining your feelings produced more pain than staying quiet did, where you said, "I'm hurt," and got told you were too sensitive, where expressing need was treated as an inconvenience rather than a communication. Or maybe you trusted someone completely and opened yourself to them, and they used what you shared against you later. Not dramatically, but in the quiet, specific way that the people closest to us sometimes do. The way they return what you said in trust as a weapon in an argument. Or maybe the experience was simpler and therefore more total. You explained yourself again and again with increasing precision, and it never arrived. Not because you weren't clear enough, because the person you were explaining yourself to was never trying to understand. They were waiting for you to finish so they could respond. John Bowlby, who spent his career documenting what our earliest relationships teach us about the safety of being known, found that the nervous system does not simply forget these early lessons. It files them and applies them with extraordinary consistency across decades, across different people, across completely different contexts. The body that learned that explaining yourself led to being hurt does not wait to be hurt again before applying that lesson. It simply stops explaining. You stopped explaining yourself when explaining yourself stopped being safe. The child who learned that lesson was not being difficult. They were being accurate. I am not going to tell you that stopping the explanations has not cost you anything. It has. It has cost you the people who might have been safe but never got to prove it because you applied the rule to everyone rather than just the ones who had earned its application. It has cost you the specific intimacy of being known before you finished understanding yourself. That is a real cost, and the version of you who stopped explaining paid it without being consulted. But here is what the same mechanism gave you. The same nervous system that learned to stop handing its interior over to everyone also learned something rarer. The difference between people who want to understand you and people who want to use what you say about yourself to manage, dismiss, or defeat you. Most people never learn this because they never had to. You learned it at considerable cost. Stopping the explanations was not you closing a door. It was you finally noticing which doors had only ever been traps. There is a concept in trauma psychology called the window of tolerance. It is the emotional range within which genuine communication is actually possible. When you are outside that window, flooded, raw, too far in it, no real conversation can happen. No one can hear anything clearly. Nothing productive gets said. You knew this before you knew the name. Your silence was never the refusal of conversation. It was the management of the conditions under which a real one might be possible. In a world that demands you justify your stillness, your silence, your pain. The decision to stop performing clarity for people who never intended to understand it is not coldness. It is the beginning of something that looks very slowly like peace. What we have been calling your emotional unavailability tonight is, at its root, a very old decision made by a self that had been given no other options. You explained yourself. It cost you. You explained yourself again. It cost you again. And at some point, the explanation stopped arriving in your throat before it ever reached your mouth. Not because you closed, because you learned. The work now, if you choose it, is not to start explaining yourself to everyone. It is to notice, with increasing gentleness, the people who are asking because they genuinely want to know, not because they need to win, not because they want leverage, but because knowing you is something they consider a privilege. They exist in the version of you that stopped explaining is exactly the one who will recognize them. If you have watched this entire video, you already know which part of it landed somewhere specific for you. You do not need me to name it. You have been turning it over since the moment you heard it. You have not stopped letting people in. You have become specific about who deserves to be. If this video gave you language for something you've been carrying quietly, there is more here. Subscribe. Come back whenever you're ready. I will be here. And if you're willing, tell me in the comments, what was the moment you stopped explaining yourself to someone? Not how it felt afterward. The moment itself. You might find, when you look at the replies, that the moment was more common than you thought.